Thank you for engaging in that prayer with us this morning. We're going to turn now to John 13. If you have a Bible, I unfortunately was not able to put together some words to put on the screen. So if you have a Bible, or maybe on your phone, turn there to John chapter 13. I need to just preface this first by saying, I realize if you're a teenager in this room today, anywhere from probably 10 to 17, the 90s probably feel to you like the 60s felt to me, okay? I need to acknowledge that. But I understand that the TV show Friends is making a comeback among folks a little bit younger than me, all right? There's an episode from the show Friends, season 5, in which there's a whole thing going on about Phoebe, who's one of the characters in the show. She wants to do a selfless deed, a truly selfless deed. And everybody, her friends, the other friends, right, continue to kind of like show her, is there really, they kind of ponder this question, is there really such a thing as a true selfless deed? And I've got to acknowledge, when I look at my own life, and I don't know if you feel this or recognize this or see this, sometimes when I choose how and where I'm going to serve someone else or with a community or whatever way there is of serving, I've tended in my life to sometimes choose based on my perception of what the results of that service will be, and based on maybe even like the result, the ROI, right, the return on investment. I think we tend to serve when we think about, am I getting community service hours? Is there going to be pizza at the end of this thing, right? Or at least it's like I've got to I really feel that I'm making a difference, okay? Now, those things aren't inherently bad, okay? We're going to see a little bit. We need to put the blessing of service in its proper context and place. And we're going to kind of unpack that today as we look at what it is to serve, and particularly the motivation for serving from this text. And we're going to see that there is a blessing, but that's not supposed to be our first motivation for serving. So Jesus gives an object lesson to his 12 disciples in John 13. And let me just begin by reading the first few verses, and then we'll skip a few verses and finish with verses 7 through 12. Note, I just need to preface this too. This verse, John chapter 13, verse 1, begins essentially Act 2 of a two-part, like there's 2 acts in the Gospel of John. The first 12 chapters, and then chapters 13 through 21. We spent some time a few weeks ago looking at chapters 20 and 21 right after Easter. So 13 through 21, all is encapsulated in about a week. It's the whole Passion Week for Jesus. So this is the beginning of that. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave his world and go to his Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. And pay attention to this word. Jesus knew all of those things. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand." "No way," said Peter. "You shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." Now I want to, let's just skip a few down to verse 12. When he had finished washing their feet, he put back on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I've done for you?" he asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that's what I am. But now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. So when it comes to serving, what does it look like for us to be followers? Evergreen, our mission, why we exist, our purpose is to grow passionate followers of Jesus. Here we learn a little bit about what it is to be a follower of Jesus and how to grow in that. And Jesus actually gives us the outline for the rest of the sermon today. He gives us the plan of how to grow in knowing to follow him when it comes to how we serve. To understand what he's done for us, and then to go and do likewise. But right in the middle of that, we also need to receive his service as well. We need to learn how to receive service. So let's first begin with understanding, just as the 12 disciples in the upper room needed to, we too need to understand his service. Not just in our heads, but to get it, to have it seep into our souls, to really understand the magnitude of Jesus' act of service, and that this becomes, as I've said before, an object lesson pointing to the cross. Knowing who he was, knowing his identity, knowing that he was none less than God himself, because he knew that, since he knew that, from his place of identity in who he was, he got up from the table, got up from his place. He was at the head of the table. There's a bit of, the head of the table is not such a big thing in my own life, but this was a big deal of who was sitting at the place of honor at the table. It was a big deal. Jesus was at the place of honor in this particular meal. He got up and left that place, and he humbled himself. The way Paul talks about it in Philippians 2 is Jesus being in himself, in his very nature God, humbled himself, taking on the nature of a servant. I don't know if you've ever anybody ever seen a foot washing or done a foot washing? Sometimes people do foot washings in weddings. I was part of a church for a few months that actually made this a bit more of a sacramental thing, where it's this is one of the things Jesus commanded us to do. And I really believe that Jesus was more giving an object lesson than no, you need to actually do this thing. But it's awkward, it's uncomfortable. I went to a Maundy Thursday service one time, and part of this was an Anglican church, and part of an Anglican Maundy Thursday service, maybe there are other traditions that do this, I don't know, was that the priest chose someone out of the congregation, had them come up and wash the feet of this random person from the congregation. It's a little uncomfortable, even in a relatively clean Western world, modern context where feet maybe get a little smelly, but there's, it's still feet, right? It's all uncomfortable. But what's happening in this text is even more radical for those who are experiencing it. And that's why Peter is so incensed by what Jesus is doing, because what Jesus is doing is completely upside down from everything his whole society is saying that he should do and should be. You're in the place of honor. You're Lord. Not only are you a rabbi, but Peter knows that Jesus is Messiah. What are you doing? He's so incensed, and Jesus is going, this is exactly how things work in my kingdom. Jesus is giving them and us a model of humility. Knowing who he was, he humbled himself. So the motivation is from humility. Jesus' whole being is wrapped up in how he can meet the needs of others. He's not concerned with his position, his place, his authority. He has that stuff, okay? He doesn't like completely let all that go. He has it, but from his position, he still serves the disciples. With selfless love, the act of service, the act of taking up the basin and the towel. The meal has already started, John tells us. They're in an upper room. They're in just the fact that there is an upper room in this house means that it's a wealthier person. And Jesus has made some sort of deal, probably, with a wealthier person in the city of Jerusalem, in which they've been given a room to host and have Passover together. Normally, in that space, the host would have a servant in the house, and it was the servant's job to do the thing of washing the feet of people, of guests. There's no servant present, and none of the disciples will do it. They've actually gone all the way to where they're eating the Passover meal, and then we learned from Luke that at some point in the middle of this, the disciples all start arguing about who's the greatest among them. Like the hierarchy, like who's the coolest, who is the most faithful, who's the best student, right? To the rabbi Jesus, who's the best student, right? And Jesus, I can just imagine, maybe you just imagine with me, Jesus kind of like looking around at this conversation. Silently, he gets up from his place at the table and he just begins this act of service. And I think all the disciples, like Peter kind of indicates, you just sense their jaws dropped. What is going on here? And Jesus simply goes and serves. He sees, there's an object lesson here, but at the core of it, he sees a need, and he sees that no one else will do it. He sees that the call is to do something that no one else really wants to do, and he's called to kind of do something, to take a lowly place. To serve from a lowly place and do a thing. There's a need, it's real, it's ordinary to just wash someone's feet. It was an ordinary thing that happened back then. But all of this is an object lesson, a sign pointing toward the cross. Having loved his own, John tells us, he loved them to the end. That introduction, that's like a whole introduction to not just this object lesson, but to the rest of Jesus' passion. He loved his own. That's not just them, that's you and that's me. Loved us to the utmost, as far as he could love us. Be suffering, shame, cruelty. Jesus has humbled himself, taking on the nature of a servant for us. He has served us. So how do we follow? First of all, before we can really truly follow, we've got to receive from Jesus. And friends, there is a humility needed in receiving. It's not easy to receive service from each other or from Jesus, because it requires us letting go of our own ability to provide, our own ability to that we've got it, that we can handle it ourselves. It requires acknowledging, I need you. I have a need and I'm not capable of filling it. It requires a humility to receive as well. I'm going to go ahead and go there. That one of the things that Love Inc. does that I'm really excited about, our staff has actually been through this course, is a course called Dignity Serves. There's a handful of people at Evergreen who've been through the course. It's just 6 weeks long, but you learn what's called mutual interdependence. The reality that we depend on each other. That's what life is like in community, and that the real heart of service and the way community is built is by this mutual interdependence. Well, the thing is that to be mutually interdependent, you kind of need to, everybody has to practice humility in that giving and that receiving. But when it comes to Jesus and receiving from him his life, receiving from him the gift of salvation through the cross. Yeah, that starts with humility too. You have to start by acknowledging I have a need. I'm a sinner and I need salvation. I need grace. Start there. And that's kind of what happens with Peter here in this text. When Jesus says, hey, this has to be done, not just for me to show you what I'm talking about, but the thing of the cross, I've got to make you clean too. And so Peter recognizes it, and the light goes on. Oh, I need this, Jesus. I need to be clean. We need to cry out with Peter, not just my feet, Lord, but all of me. Cleanse me fully and wholly from the inside out. So the motivation for serving for us begins with this gratitude. This humility that leads to gratitude of realizing I had a need, it was filled by Jesus, and then that gratitude transforms us. And it astounds us, and it transforms us, and then it compels us out. But out not, sometimes the out is just to our spouse, or to our kids, or our neighbor, right? Our friends, our family. But it's also out to the world. It's to the community. It's to everyone around us. But it's compelled by knowing that I've received from Jesus this service too. And so he says, I've given you an example. If I, your Lord and teacher, have done this, so you also ought, he says, to do to one another. But then, later on in the chapter, verse 34, Jesus says this. He takes it one step a little bit further, and he's speaking from his position as a rabbi, kind of speaking with authority, only it was not really very popular. Rabbi, we've heard this from Rich Ferreira a few months ago, if you've been around here for a few months. Rabbis spoke with authority, and their whole deal was that it was all about which rabbi interpreted the Torah, the law of God, the Old Testament, in which way. But it was pretty radical for a rabbi to come up and say, I've got a new commandment. I'm giving you something new here. And Jesus speaks with his authority as Lord when he says, I give you a new commandment. And when you actually look back, it's actually not all that new, because the words are there in the Old Testament, but somehow they'd gotten lost. I give you a new commandment, to love one another as I have loved you by washing your feet, so you also ought to love one another. Love is at the heart of service. Love and humility tied together are for the other person. Truly, a heart of service, the motivation for service that comes from our soul, comes from a place of slowly, over time, with Jesus, and with the bedrock of knowing that I belong to Jesus, that my identity is wrapped up in him, that learning that, then what happens is over time, that other identity, that old identity that's wrapped up in my ego and my benefit and my heroism, all of that has to die. Well, great. My ego has to die and be shattered. We are invited, Jesus is inviting them and us to a downward journey. And friends, sometimes it feels like death. Laura actually mentioned that earlier, that sometimes serving feels like being called to die, because there's a part of us, the false self, the ego part of us, that does need to die, and that Jesus is calling us to. Every time I do the dishes in the house, right? Every time I notice something in me that just goes, hey, right? I did the dishes. That's got to die. You know, that part of me is just, what is it like to just not need the accolades and the attaboys? To be here for the other, for you, for your health, for your flourishing, for your benefit. That's the heart of service. That's the motivation that service is about. So what are the actions that we engage? The so what? What is the basin and the towel for us? Well, there's all kinds of stuff. Depends on, now here's the thing. I do believe that serving ought to be, I'm not saying that serving shouldn't be fun, okay? There is a part of service that you don't have to always do the worst thing, the thing that you hate. Doesn't mean you can't have pizza, okay? But I think there's a thing, the 80-20 principle can be applied in all kinds of different ways, but one way that I like to kind of understand the 80-20 principle is 80% of the time you do stuff that like fits like your heart, your passion, your gifting, your abilities, your talents. 80% of the time you're going to find ways to serve that are that. But there's also another 20% that's just stuff that just needs to be done. No one wants to do it, but it has to be done. It's vital, it's necessary. Jesus is calling it, that's part of the basin and towel for us, is to serve in those ways too. That we're called to do the simple, and here's the thing about service, it's ordinary. For that day, it was very ordinary. Most houses had a basin and a towel at the door where feet got washed. It's ordinary. There's plenty of stuff to do here inside the walls. The reality is that church doesn't happen without you and I together, rallying together, mutually depending on one another to serve and make church happen. Not just worship, but during the week too. There's plenty to do here at Evergreen. There's plenty to do in our community. We have 2 opportunities in the courtyard today. We heard from Jody. There's another opportunity to help with food, to serve through food, through hand to hand. There's plenty to do, and plenty of need. As the church, I personally think that there's changes. COVID has brought a shift and a change in the life of the church. We don't even know what that is yet. We're kind of off the map on some of this, okay? But the way that we're going to get together, we're going to move forward, is only by serving together. Only by realizing that I need you and you need me. As crazy as it sounds, but we need each other because we each have needs that we each other can fill. That's another song from the 60s, isn't it? And then Jesus says, now that you know these things, you'll be blessed if you do them. But what happens is when we're in that journey of dying to ourselves, when we are learning from Jesus this gratitude that compels us to find a need and fill it, and we just start doing it, we do learn, we find ourselves content or at peace in some way or another, like maybe not circumstantially, but somewhere we begin to sense over time that God's at work, God's present here, God's doing something, there's change happening. We can tell the stories of how serving and giving gifts changed lives, but we're telling not our story, not to raise up how we're so cool, but to raise up what God is doing and how God is transforming one at a time in individual lives. But as much of those one at a times and those changes happen in each of us, what then begins to happen is the community flourishes. And so we find that we are living a life of experiencing the goodness of God. And then over time, the community begins to feel the goodness of God as that goodness spreads. That's how the world gets changed. It's as simple as that. It's not rocket science. We see people transformed. We see people turning their lives around. We see addictions crumbling. We see forgiveness taking place. When we do things like serving coffee, greeting, shaking hands, teaching our children, Those are all living into vows that we've made when we join the church or every time we have a baptism and welcome Sunday here. We make vows that we're going to support one another. So that's also a blessing that we get to fulfill our vows together that we make before each other and before God. We sense that God is with us and for us. Amen. Let's pray. Jesus, you said the harvest is plentiful and the workers are few. Jesus, some of us, life isn't together yet. Things are hard right now, and where do we find the time? But also, maybe the need is right in front of us. We just can't see it yet. So would you show us the need? Would you lead us toward it? Would you let us become so astounded by and continually grateful for your sacrifice and your service of us, and how you washed not just our feet, but our whole selves. And may that just compel us together as a community to see Hudsonville, Jenison, Zeeland, and all the other areas represented changed by the power of your gospel and your good news. Amen.